Right, and the term used is front running. So they've got inside information. They can put their orders in ahead of the crowd, and they benefit once the crowd shows up. So another way to describe that would be toll booths. You know, it's almost like Sherwood Forest, and you put in the bandits in the forest who are constantly shaking down travelers going through the forest. And this is pretty much what's happening in the U.S. and around the world today. You've got a bunch of bandits who are shaking down folks as they try to get their money from one location to another. Now, you say that no more than a dozen families control the central banks around the world. Give us some names. Who are these families?
Well, you have the Rockefellers across, of course, the Rothschilds, or I guess the American, we as Americans pronounce it Rothschild, but I believe the correct pronunciation, because it's German, is like Rothschild family in Europe. You have the J.P. Morgan family. I know those are like three of the top families. You also have the original founders of the U.S. Fed Reserve included the owners of City National Bank, which eventually became Citigroup. So just the top families you would think, the Warburgs, etc.
Okay, now you've got a chart showing the concentration of wealth over the past 30 years. 70% of the gains went to the top 1%. And yet, during the same time, polls show that Americans actually grew more convinced that just the opposite was happening. Talk about the ideological subversion and the transformation of lies into truth.
Sure, I think we as a society, I think we've lost the capacity to think for ourselves. So we depend upon, like 30-second sound bites. That's how we want our information, unfortunately. We become like an ADD society, attention deficit disorder society, where, we watch the news and in 30 seconds, we want to know the whole story. So we get just a bunch of misleading headlines all the time. And that's how society basically, ingests and they incorporate their information, which, since the bankers also run the media, they put out the headlines that they want, as far as the information they want people to believe. And I think that's what's going on now, Max.
Well, it reminds me, 150, 200 years ago when the U.S. was rolling across the Western Plains. They gave the Indians treaties. These treaties turned out to be worthless, and they ended up on reservations. In the U.S. today, these folks, the new folks, the white man, is getting paper from the Federal Reserve, which turns out to be worthless, and they're ending up on reservations and in concentration camps of one nature or another. Now, one of the arguments against the gold standard is that it caused the Great Depression. Many say that under a gold standard, the U.S. could end up like Greece, for example, which is essentially having to live under the gold standard, if you will, of being locked into the euro.
Okay, well, again, I think in every case, if you really analyze what happened during periods where a gold standard existed, it was not actually the gold standard that caused these economic shocks. It was actually the bankers' abandonment of the gold standard that caused these shocks. So it was the refusal to keep an honest and sincere and truthful gold standard that caused the shocks. Like you can look at World War I, when the international currency was the British pound, and the Bank of England abandoned the gold standard basically to finance the war. And so after the war, when there's twice as many pounds supporting the same amount of gold, so each pound basically should have been worth half the amount of gold it represented before, the Bank of England refused to revalue the conversion rate because they didn't want the pound to lose its status as an international currency. So basically the bankers went off the gold standard, but they wanted the world to believe they still had held the integrity to the gold standard. The people that realized the scam knew now they had pounds that they were going to receive twice as much gold as they really should. So when people went to the Bank of England and went to the bankers and demanded gold for the devalued pounds, the bankers panicked because they knew they were going to lose all their gold. So they turned to the United States and asked the U.S. Fed Reserve to lower the interest rates. And when the U.S. lowered the interest rates to accommodate the Bank of England to help stop the run on gold in England, that's when basically you had the roaring 20s. And then you had the stock market crash. So it was actually going off the gold standard, even though the bankers were telling the world we were still on the gold standard. It was their fraud and their deceit that caused, the depression.
Yeah, sure. The same thing with Nixon in the 70s to pay for the Vietnam War. He went off the gold standard. And then this set up everything was in motion to create that big inflationary spike in the late 70s, early 80s, and it created huge turmoil in the market. But once again, reinforcing your point, he went off the gold standard to pay for the Vietnam War. If he simply stayed on the gold standard, he wouldn't have been able to afford the war, and America would have avoided, tens of thousands of casualties and being entangled in a huge loss in that war.
Exactly, Max. So that's exactly my point. People that criticize the gold standard said, "Oh, the gold standard didn't work because you had huge periods of inflation. It caused economic chaos in the past." It was actually the bankers' abandonment of the gold standard that caused it.
Right. Well, this idea of being able to create money willy-nilly out of thin air, it's not only endemic in the central bank facilities, but you also see it in corporate America because corporate America can create shares and options at will. They can continue to just dilute themselves without any checks or balances, really, especially when the board of directors tends to be in the pocket of a clique of one or two guys on the board. And you see this in the government, of course, can issue bonds, really what I would call counterfeit bonds. They're not collateralized by anything. So counterfeiting is a huge problem. And what I don't understand is something very basic. Maybe you can help me work through this. When I talk to people around the world who are activists or environmentalists, and they're trying to protect the environment against corporate encroachment into the environment, I always say, well, get these companies to stop counterfeiting bonds and creating money from thin air. This takes away their wherewithal to continue their ecological holocaust. And the activists will always, they don't seem to understand the connection between having the money to commit these crimes and fraud and immoral activity and their activities as activists possibly to cut them off from that money.
Yeah, I think that's the exact problem. You nailed the nail around the head, Max, is that people don't connect the dots, right? They have a very hard time connecting the dots from the fraudulent nature of the monetary system, the financial system, to other problems we have in the world, like ecological problems, or even if you look at bankers, the funny thing is you could probably take like three sectors of people. You could take counterfeiters, right? Say just people that counterfeit, even just goods, right? Fake goods. They counterfeit Louis Vuitton bags, and so they hurt the revenue, say LVMH, right? Or you could take people that rob convenience stores every day, and you could take bankers and how they counterfeit money. And I guarantee you can quantify this, right? So you can quantify the times the U.S. Fed Reserve has devalued the U.S. dollar by 15% a year, and how much wealth that stole from all the dollar holders in the United States. And you can quantify, say, for the counterfeiter, the guy that's counterfeiting Louis Vuitton bags, and how much revenue he's stealing from LVMH. And it would not compare, to the damage, to the moral hazard that bankers are creating. You probably need like a million counterfeiters, and you probably need like a million thieves that are robbing convenience stores every day to create the same economic destruction of wealth that bankers create, when you compare these different groups. But people don't get it.